Welcome to the Bookbibuli podcast. And we are talking about Mrs. Frisby today. Mrs. Frisby, a widowed mouse with four small children, must move her family to their summer quarters immediately or face almost certain death. But her youngest son, Timothy, lies ill with pneumonia and must not be moved. Fortunately, she encounters the rats of NIMH, an extraordinary breed of highly intelligent creatures who come up with a brilliant solution to her dilemma. We have Mannan with us today to discuss this interesting book. Hello, Mannan.
Thank you for having me here today. I am Mannan. I am 9 years old and I stay in Delhi. I am a reader and therefore a dreamer. My ideal world would comprise of books and Lego.
That's great. Now let's talk about the book. How does the author, Robert Bryan, establish the unique perspective of the animal characters in this book? And how do you think it contributes to the overall tone?
The animal characters in the book control the narrative of the book. They are the main players, although they are affected by the world managed by humans. The different animals like mice, rats, crow, and the shrew talk and act differently as if all of them carry a unique personality, and it looks like the author has closely observed them. The book allows the readers to see from different viewpoints as the story moves forward.
The central theme of the book is courage in the novel. Where do you think Mrs. Frisby and the rats demonstrate bravery? And how does their bravery and their courage drive the plot forward?
I can identify many such instances where Mrs. Frisby and the rats demonstrated bravery. It must have taken a lot of courage for Mrs. Frisby to save the crow Jeremy from the cat and ride on him and then enter the tree's hollow alone to ask the owl for help. Not just this, she went to the rose bush to meet the rats. But to top it all, that she went to Mr. Fitzgibbon's house to put sleeping powder in the cat's food. I think that time she really must have been scared. The rats, too, showed a lot of courage since the time they were trapped in the NIMH. And also, the 10 rats who stayed behind were extremely brave. Their courage and determination to learn and succeed, in my opinion, added so much to the story. Also, Mr. Aegis and Mr. Jonathan Frisby were willing to take the risk of saving 6 mice in the NIMS vents. Not to forget little Timothy, who was himself ill and was still trying to comfort his mother.
The character of Mrs. Frisby features in the title itself. Why don't you tell us about the character development of Mrs. Frisby throughout the story? How does she evolve emotionally and intellectually as she faces various challenges?
If there's a single person who is the star of the story, it's Mrs. Frisby. In the beginning, she's a lady mouse who's trying to raise her kids after losing her husband. But as the story moves forward, we see a change in her personality. She tries to look confident in front of her children when she herself is scared. After knowing the truth about her husband, she truly understands how he felt towards her, not just her kids. She felt strongly for the rats too. In the end, she was extremely grateful.
The rats of NIMH, are highly intelligent due to their exposure to experimental drugs. How does the author explore the ethical implications of scientific experimentation on animals? And how do these implications shape the narrative?
The story tells us the impact of experimental drugs on rats. But from the rat's point of view, the drugs make them super intelligent, and that's how they escape from the lab. The doctors do it for research to be later used on humans. But it sounds very selfish as the rats narrate how they were captured, kept in cages, and made to run through the mazes after getting injections. But the knowledge gained by them unwillingly at first made them lead a superior life later on, matching that of the humans.
You're a constant at all our events, Mannan, and we are glad to see you every time. It is for readers like you that we have started the North Star program. How do you like it?
The North Star program by Bookbibuli is a unique program. Its comprehensive approach is sure to make every child an avid reader. I'm sure a lot of effort goes into finding age appropriate, meaningful books. It provides an opportunity for like minded readers to mingle and discuss their favorite books and characters. It is sure to make anyone fall in love with reading even more. The book readings and the podcasts are the cherry on the cake.
Well, thank you for the cherry on the cake. Let's talk about the pacing of the book now. Did the story keep you engaged, or were there any moments that felt rushed or slow? And did the pacing impact your overall reading experience?
Oh, yes, the story kept me engaged, especially the part when Nicodemus tells about the past and all about Nim. I did not want the story to stop when Mrs. Frisby had to go to her home at noon for feeding her kids. I think I would have added something eventful to the part where Mrs. Frisby waits in the library while the rats are in a meeting.
Now let's consider the role of the owl in the story. How does the owl serve as a mentor or guide for Mrs. Frisby? And how does this relationship impact and influence the trajectory of the plot?
Oh, it's definitely the owl who got the action started in the story. The wise owl was grumpy in the beginning, but when he got to know that Mrs. Frisby's husband was Jonathan, he changed. He told Mrs. Frisby to meet the rats, as only they could help her. He was also smart enough to know where to move her house so that it is saved from the plough. It was his plan which Mrs. Frisby and the rats acted upon.
Now, on to the book's resolution, the end of the book. Were you satisfied with how the various storylines concluded? And were there any surprises or twists that caught you off guard?
I'm glad that Mrs. Frisby's house was shifted and Timothy was saved. But two rats died even when they knew a poisonous gas will be pumped in their hole. I didn't like that, and the mystery of those two remained unsolved. Also, the rats leaving all the machinery behind was unfair as they had worked so hard to gain that much knowledge.
Thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you for bringing up the topic of experiments on animals.
It has been a pleasure being on the Book Bibuli podcast today. Thank you for making me a part of Book Bibuli.
The novel centers around a colony of escaped lab rats, the rats of NIMH, who live in a technologically sophisticated and literate society mimicking that of humans. They come to the aid of Mrs. Frisby, a widowed field mouse who seeks to protect her children and home from destruction by a farmer's plow. The rats tell Mrs. Frisby a wild story about being captured and taken to some scary lab. By the way, NIMH stands for National Institute of Mental Health, which is a real place where they are experimented upon, learn to read, get super brilliant, and eventually escape from captivity. And now it's time for Bookbibuli Read Record. Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim is a thought provoking book dealing with the subject of family, sacrifice, teamwork, and leading kids to think about their feelings on animal testing. The language of the book is simple and the story is wonderful. The rats need to stay away from pesky humans. Interesting, isn't it? It should be read by children above 8 years of age and will create a healthy dialogue about role of science and about animal testing. The predecessors of this book would be Stuart Little, Watership Down, and Island of the Blue Dolphins. And the app's successor would be Julie of the Wolves by Jean George. We shall see you next week. Until then, better read, read better.